I have a feeling, in fact, no, I would say I know most Christians don't test everything. In fact, I think it's pretty safe to say that most Christians don't test a lot of the things that they watch, listen to, or read. They simply take in information, allowing themselves to be changed by it without knowing that it is happening, how it is happening, or what effect it will have on them as a person. Hello, my name is Jared Hiebert, and this is the Here I Sit podcast. Today we are delving once again into your questions, and once again we will deal with 3 of them. This will be the penultimate episode before we take a break for August. But don't worry, we will be back in September, Lord willing. So let's get it kicked off right away. All of these questions that we're going to answer today kind of have a very similar theme about knowing, how can we know, etc., etc. So question number 1. What are the main doctrines or beliefs that are required for Orthodox Christian faith? And where do we or can we be guardians to these Orthodox beliefs? This is a great question, a very important question. We dealt with the theme of this question way back when we talked about dispensationalism in our early days of this podcast. And dispensationalism actually provides a really good example to get us started in answering this question. So I want to return to what I said back then, obviously a paraphrase. So what we need to understand right at the very beginning is that not every belief is primary, ultimate, worth dying for, as I like to say, worth taking a bullet for. There are many beliefs that fall outside of the center. Now, sadly, the issues of days of creation, the schedule of end times events, in particular, especially in North America, have become a center for many people's definition of orthodoxy. They've become boundary markers of correct belief. And yet, when we look at church history, we realize that those 2 things, days of creation, orders of end times events, have never actually been that important. I've experienced this personally, as I mentioned back then, both in the classroom and in the pastorate. In my previous pastorate, in the denomination of which I was a part, I was told, hey, I was outside of the tent, meaning I couldn't be ordained, I couldn't represent the denomination, I couldn't serve on any of the committees in the denomination simply because I was not a dispensationalist. I was a covenant theologian, I was outside the tent. Now, we agreed, the denomination and myself, on the central tenets of the Christian faith. The vast majority of other doctrines we were in agreement regarding, but I was outside the tent on this one issue, and therefore disqualified for greater ministry within our fellowship of churches. And as I mentioned back then, essentially what they were saying to me was that not only me, but also Augustine and John Calvin, B.B. Warfield, Martin Luther, Charles Spurgeon, John Knox, John Piper, Mark Dever, R.C. Sproul, James Montgomery Boyce, Jonathan Edwards, A.W. Pink, Sam Storms, Sinclair Ferguson, Tim Keller, J.I. Packer, James White, Philip Reich, and F.F. Bruce. On and on and on I could go. All of them would be disqualified for ordination on account of their eschatological views within that particular fellowship of churches. Now, as I mentioned then, I'll mention again, it's distressing to me that Christians who hold to the same gospel, have the same priorities for gospel-centered ministry, and who desire the discipleship of the church and the world are so quick to put those who disagree with them about end times issues and a whole bunch of other secondary issues outside of the proverbial tent. So there is a need, a very important need, in fact, I think a biblical command, to distinguish main or central doctrines which must be defended aggressively and even died for if necessary, versus secondary or even tertiary doctrines, which are things that again, as I like to say, I would not take a bullet for. So let's start our discussion of how to deal with this from Scripture. In the book of Jude, he writes, verse 3, "Beloved, although I was very eager to write to you about our common salvation, I found it necessary to write appealing to you to contend for the faith that was once for all delivered to the saints." So the action here that Jude is calling for is to contend for the faith. The verb contend here comes from the language of athletic competition. In Jewish literature, it depicts the struggle which the pious has to go through in this world. In the New Testament, this word family, this word group, describes the effort necessary to pursue the Christian life and the effort necessary to continue on within ministry. So Jude's readers are encouraged here, instructed, commanded to contend for the faith that was once for all delivered to the saints. Now, the word faith here is not subjective. It refers to the content of what is believed, the truths of the gospel and all of their entailments for right living. This faith was once for all delivered to the saints. Now, this expression signals the decisive revelation of the gospel in and through Jesus Christ, which is then authoritatively passed down by the apostles. Or we could say it this way. What we seek to defend is the whole counsel of God concerning all things necessary for his own glory, man's salvation, faith, and life. That's the Westminster Confession, chapter 1.6. But not all doctrines need the same level of defense. Thus, the need for what has been called theological triage. Now, I was first introduced to this idea in an article written about 20 years ago by Albert Mohler. It's called A Call for Theological Triage and Christian Maturity. You can find it online. Go to Albert Mohler's website. It'll be there. It is also defended and outlined in much more detail in 2 book-length treatments, both of which I would recommend. Finding the Right Hills to Die On by Gavin Ortlund, that was written in 2020. And then a little bit more of a technical work, When Doctrine Divides, an Evangelical Approach to Theological Diversity by Ryan Putman, also written in 2020. Again, both of these books are dealing with the same topic in largely the same way, so they're complementary. Ortlund will take a bit more of a pastoral approach, a little bit easier read, while Putman has a little bit more of an academic purpose behind his writing. So my summary of the idea of theological triage will rely largely on Mohler's article, but will include also elements from these other works as well. So Mohler mentions this as sort of the framework for which we should understand triage. So this is how he starts things off. He says, a trip to the local hospital emergency room some years ago alerted me, this is Mohler talking, to an intellectual tool that is most helpful in fulfilling our theological responsibility. In recent years, emergency medical personnel have practiced a discipline known as triage, a process that allows the trained personnel to make a quick evaluation of the nature of the medical emergency. So we've all been to an emergency room with an issue or of various levels of seriousness, and when you get in there, into the reception area, someone must be armed with the medical expertise to make an immediate determination of medical priority. Which patients need to be rushed into a room, maybe even prepped for surgery. Which patients can wait for a less urgent examination. Medical personnel, when dealing with people coming into the emergency room, cannot flinch from asking questions and from taking responsibility so that the patients all receive the kind of care that is most critical for them. The ones with the most critical injuries get top priority. The other ones move on down the line. Now, the word triage for those of you who are interested, comes from the French word trier, which I have brutalized. It simply means to sort. And so the triage officer in the medical context is the frontline agent, the first person who meets a patient and then decides who needs the most urgent care. And without a process, somebody who comes in with a scraped knee would receive the same kind of consideration as somebody who is having a heart attack or a stroke. The same discipline that brings order into the hectic arena of the emergency room can also offer, in Mohler's mind, great assistance to Christians as they seek to defend the truth in the present age. And so, taking that general idea, a discipline of theological triage is then brought forward. And this would require Christians to determine a scale of theological urgency that would correspond to the medical world's framework for who gets priority of treatment. Now, Mohler outlines 3 levels of theological issues on this scale. Now, I think somewhere on one side of me, a chart is going to pop up here. It doesn't come directly from Mohler to my knowledge, but it's an example of the kinds of things that would fall into each level of theological importance as he outlines it. And so as you look at this table, it becomes obvious that some of these issues would be considered higher on the scale than others by some and dropped lower by others. Again, hence the need to do theological triage. And we'll get into this in a few minutes. Now, first level theological issues are those that include doctrines most central and essential to the Christian faith. These first order doctrines represent the most fundamental truths of the Christian faith, and if you deny these doctrines, it would represent nothing less than an eventual, if not immediate, denial of Christianity itself. And Gavin Ortlund suggests, and I think rightly so, that these doctrines are often tightly tied to the gospel itself. The second order doctrines are distinguished from the first order by the fact that believing Christians may disagree on the second order issues without denying the fundamentals of the gospel. Now, this disagreement is not insignificant, as it will create significant boundaries between believers. When Christians organize themselves into congregations and denominations or fellowships or whatever you want to call them, these boundaries become almost immediately evident. Now, Mohler recognizes the meaning, mode, and recipients of baptism as being one example of a divisive second-order doctrine. Baptists and Presbyterians, Baptists and Reformed denominations fervently disagree over the most basic understanding of Christian baptism. Ortlund suggests that these are doctrines which are urgent for the health and practice of the church. Yet, when we return to Mohler, Christians across a vast denominational range can stand together on the first order doctrines and recognize each other as authentic believers while understanding that the existence of second order disagreements prevents the closeness of fellowship that we would otherwise enjoy. A church will either recognize infant baptism or it will not. And that choice immediately creates a second order conflict with those who take the opposite position as their conviction. Third order issues are doctrines over which Christians may disagree and remain in close fellowship even within local congregations. We mentioned earlier the idea of dispensationalism. Mohler talks about this as well. Eschatological issues fit within this category. Ortlund suggests that these are doctrines that are important to Christian theology. They're all important to Christian theology, but they're not enough of an importance to justify separating or dividing Christians. So the question then becomes, how do we know where we are in the table? In other words, how do we know where to put the doctrines, level 1, 2, or 3? Now, we've talked a little bit about that already, the tightness of the gospel, but let me just expand a little bit more. I think a broad reading of historical theology is a really good place to start. As we read church history with all of its doctrinal debates and its discussions, as well as reading the historic creeds and confessions, we will, I think, very quickly discover what doctrines are more important than others. But there are other tests that are equally important. Putman outlines 3 of them, which I think provide really helpful guidelines. The first one is what he calls the hermeneutical test. The clearer the Bible teaches a doctrine, the more likely that it belongs on a higher tier. Now, when I say that, please don't understand that the more clearly it teaches a doctrine, the more it belongs into tier 1. I'm just suggesting that the more it teaches a doctrine, the more likely it is that it is something that we should consider bumping up into whatever tier above that we currently have that doctrine. Then the gospel test, he also talks about. The more central a doctrine is to the gospel, the more likely it belongs on a higher tier, and more than likely on tier number 1. And then he talks about the praxis test. What he means by that is the more a doctrine affects the practice of the church, the practice of a believer, the more likely that it belongs, again, on a higher tier. Now, obviously, this kind of thing doesn't always lead us where we want to go. This is not a perfect way of going about things. There are dangers that we must be aware of as we do theological triage, but none of them, I believe, leads us to completely throwing out this practical concept as a way of ordering our doctrines and guiding our discussions with both unbelievers and fellow believers. So just a couple of things before we move on to our next question. Does this kind of division of doctrines into 3 orders mean that we hedge on scriptural truth, or that we take biblical doctrines with less seriousness than we should as we move away from the central doctrines? In other words, should we hold on really tightly to the doctrines in level 1 and care less and less and less about the doctrines as we move down in their order? Well, Moeller says no. We are charged to embrace and to teach the whole counsel of God, the comprehensive truthfulness of the Christian faith as revealed in the Holy Scriptures. There are no insignificant doctrines revealed in the Bible, but there is an essential foundation of truth that undergirds the entire system of biblical truth, biblical doctrine. So if we're looking for a place to dig in, a place that is non-negotiable, it is always going to be in the first order level of doctrine. Which then brings up another question. What attitudes do we hold at each level? If we're going to dig in on level 1, well, what should our attitude be towards level 2 doctrines, or 3 or 4, or however many we're going to have? Well, Ortland suggests courage and conviction in holding to first-rank doctrines, first-order doctrines. These are the non-negotiables. Then he suggests wisdom and balance concerning second-rank doctrines. And finally, circumspection and restraint for third-rank doctrines. And then humility as we express our understanding of all doctrine. So to go back to Augustine in the 5th century, in essentials, unity; in non-essentials, liberty; in all things, charity. I think that's a very good piece of wisdom as we end our discussion on this question. So to provide a simple answer to the question posed, I would say this. The closer the doctrine is to the gospel, the greater our defense of it should be. Or to put it negatively, if a change in orthodox doctrine moves away from historical theology in such a way that it changes the gospel, which we are warned in Scripture very, very strongly against doing, we must rise up against that change. Now on to our second question. With so many people plugged into social media and the amount of information being crammed into our heads in short bursts, how do we sift through that information to find truth? The person asking the question offers the example of healthy living, diet, science, history, etc., etc. Now, I'm going to ignore those examples and just answer the question as it stands. And again, very good and really, really important question, given the times in which we live and the access to information that we all have. I think the answer to this question is a lot more simple than we would think it to be. So let me offer 6 suggestions. Now, I say it's simple, and then now I'm offering 6 suggestions. So if that's not simple to you, I apologize. So 6 suggestions. First, we need to be aware that this is a problem. I'm currently working through what is turning out to be a fantastic book that puts its finger on exactly this problem. It's called The Death of Expertise, The Campaign Against Established Knowledge and Why It Matters by Tom Nichols. I forgot my copy at home, so I don't have it here to show you. And in that book, he writes about the problem as he sees it. Quote, "These are dangerous times. Never have so many people had so much access to so much knowledge and yet have been so resistant to learning anything." So true. He goes on to identify the issue. Quote, "I fear we are witnessing the death of the ideal of expertise itself. A Google-fueled, Wikipedia-based, blog-sodden collapse of any division between professionals and laypeople, students, teachers, knowers, and wanderers. In other words, between those of any achievement in any area and those with none at all." Oh, that's brilliantly stated. He goes on, quote, "In some ways, it is all worse than ignorance. It is unfounded arrogance. The outrage of an increasingly narcissistic culture that cannot endure even the slightest hint of inequality of any kind." That's a devastating critique, and yet very, very true. The question we're in the midst of answering is a real one with very real consequences. We need to understand where we're at. Second, we need to be aware of the effect of our depravity on our knowing and seek to have our minds constantly renewed by God's grace. Calvin said the human heart is an idol factory. This is true of every single one of us. We want to know what we want to know. We don't want to know those things that challenge us. We don't want to know those things that go against what we already know. And what I mean is we all have the propensity within us due to the noetic effects of sin. That's the effect of sin on our ability to know something. We all have a default into all sorts of cognitive and logical fallacies in order to protect our way of thinking about something. We are all at risk of cognitive dissonance, tribalism, confirmation bias, selective exposure, no true Scotsman, anchoring bias, and on I could go. We need to recognize about ourselves what Nichols writes, quote, "And some of us, as indelicate as it might be to say it, are not intelligent enough to know when we're wrong, no matter how good our intentions. Just as we are not all equally able to carry a tune or draw a straight line, many people simply cannot recognize the gaps in their own knowledge or understand their own inability to construct a logical argument." Again, brutally blunt, but brilliant. Now, in this regard, let me recommend some resources for you in this regard. Some things that will help you to get rid of some of these logical fallacies and cognitive biases that so easily creep within us. And to be aware of them, you got to know them. So let me offer you 2 books by the same author for starters. They are David McRaney, great titles, great covers. One, You Are Not So Smart. That's the first book. And the second one, You Are Now Less Dumb. And in these books, he goes through just simply cognitive biases and logical fallacies, about, 48 of them in the first book. And I think the second one, it's something in the upper 20. 17 of them in the second book. And it's good stuff to read. You can just read one short 8 to 10 page chapter at a time, just to work your way through it, just to figure out where you may have some gaps in logic, gaps in cognitive bias. The other tool that I find really helpful, it's going to seem maybe a little bit stupid, but it's actually a deck of cards. It's called Critical Thinking Cards. And I forget the company. yourlogicalfallacies.com. yourlogicalfallacies.com. And what it is it's half a deck each of cognitive biases and logical fallacies. And what I find myself doing, I have them sitting on my desk. And when I'm sort of sitting there working through something, I'm not able to maybe process something the way I thought it would, or something's confusing for me, I'm trying to figure out how to put something into words, I'll pick up these cards and I'll just kind of go through them and just kind of read through them just one by one. Very simple little tools. And as I go through them, you just sort of realize all of the ways in which we can become biased in our thinking, all of the ways in which we can be susceptible to logical fallacies. And so being aware that a problem is there and exists and might be a significant problem in my own mind is going to help me to be able to process information better and to find the truth. And as Christians, we need to be lovers of truth. So this is a really valuable thing to do. We need to recognize that we are not neutral processors of information. Sin taints our ability to read the world correctly, to interpret things that we're told about the world correctly, and it affects our ability to read the Bible correctly. Our intellect, Paul tells us in Romans 1, is bent towards self-justification, towards autonomy, towards the idolatry that Calvin speaks about. The more we believe ourselves to be gullible, naive, misinformed, not as intelligent as we think we are, and not as well informed as we could be, the better chance we have to fight against the ease at which we fall into errors. Now, there's one more thing we need to add here in this second suggestion. The noetic effects of sin affect our cultural knowing. Sadly, I think many Christians have become unsuspecting adherents and defenders of critical theory. Critical theory desires to deconstruct traditional categories of authority, things like history and science, theology, mathematics, philosophy, etc., because they view these things as part of a power structure that needs to be dismantled. So according to critical theory, all knowledge comes to us through power structures. And thus, all knowledge is not neutral, but serves the purposes of those in power. Therefore, the conclusion is that all knowledge is ideological, and therefore, nothing can be absolutely true. Or we need to doubt every piece of information that someone in the power structure is trying to give us. Which means experts can't be trusted because they are simply trying to manipulate the knowledge, the truth, to their own ends to maintain power. Thus, there is no truth, just truth to power. Now, I know many Christians who believe all of these things at some level. If I can risk offending you, just think back to the COVID days, and most of you will know what I mean about how we dealt with experts. We need to challenge ourselves as to whether or not we have believed in critical theory. Suspicion of everything is the way of madness, to borrow from Kevin Van Hooser. As Christians, we need to believe in objective truth, seek it, defend it, and live by it. Thus, what we need more than anything else is to fear the Lord, which is the beginning of knowledge, and have our minds continually renewed by God, as Paul says in Romans 12:2. The noetic effects of sin are real. The ease at which we buy into our cultural milieu is real. We need the transformation of God in the gospel to save us from both of these. Now, a lot more could be said about this, but I need to move on. Third, we need to be keenly aware of the sources from which we gain our information. I have a feeling that most Christians are not fully aware of the genesis of the media they consume. Not everyone that they listen to is an expert. Not everyone's opinion is valid or valuable. Not every piece of information we read has been tried and tested. Not every person spouting something off on the internet is worthy of our attention. Not every expert is an expert, but neither are all experts frauds. We need to start asking ourselves some serious questions about who we are listening to, where they are getting their information, and what their ideological biases are. We need to ask, who is presenting what I am reading, what I am watching? Why are they worth listening to? In other words, what qualifies them to teach me the information that they're presenting? From what perspective do they present the material? Is their perspective one with which I would agree or disagree? Are there any cognitive biases that I have which would lead me to prefer one source over another? Am I open to hearing another source from another perspective and what they have to say? Fourth, we need to vigilantly cross-reference the information we receive. Or to put it differently, we need to develop the ability to research information and think laterally. Or in biblical terms, we need to test everything, as Paul says in 1 Thessalonians 5:21. Now, the context there is prophecy. I'll grant that. But Scripture offers a laundry list of things that we are to test. Teaching, which the Bereans did, the apostles' teaching in that context in Acts 17. We are supposed to test leaders. We're supposed to test the spirits. We're supposed to test other believers, the times in which we live, and ourselves. I have a feeling, in fact, no, I would say I know most Christians don't test everything. In fact, I think it's pretty safe to say that most Christians don't test a lot of the things that they watch, listen to, or read. They simply take in information, allowing themselves to be changed by it without knowing that it is happening, how it is happening, or what effect it will have on them as a person. A number of years ago, I came across a talk entitled Informing Ourselves to Death by Neil Postman, who identified this exact thing as a problem way back in 1990, long before the internet was even mainstream. You can find this article online. I highly recommend you read it. This is what he wrote in that article. And if I remember correctly, the context was he was at a conference celebrating the advancement in computer technology, again, long before the internet was even mainstream. This is what he wrote. Information is now a commodity that can be bought and sold, or used as a form of entertainment, or worn like a garment to enhance one's status. It comes indiscriminately, directed at no one in particular, disconnected from usefulness. We are glutted with information, drowning in information, have no control over it, don't know what to do with it. Our defenses against information glut have broken down. Our information immune system is inoperable. We don't know how to filter it out. We don't know how to reduce it. We don't know how to use it. End quote. I think many of us are completely unaware of the extent to which our favorite social media apps and websites, news agencies, whatever, will go to keep us hooked on their brand of media by enacting algorithms to confirm what we like rather than challenges us with something different. Every time we open an app to consume media, we are making ourselves more and more susceptible to every cognitive bias that I've identified. We need to purposefully and actively fight against these things. We need to understand that knowing something truly takes work. We need to be willing to put in the work before we can claim to know anything. We need to read and listen to a vast swath of information from a vast swath of sources before we make decisions about what we know. In order to filter out what is counterfeit and embrace what is true, we need to put in the work of testing everything. Let me try and use an illustration here. We often let people do to our minds what we would never let them do to our bodies. We would never lay back and casually and indiscriminately allow a stranger to touch us or to poke us or to prod us. In fact, many of us are extremely aware of our physical personal space and who is and is not allowed to enter it. Just think about the last time you were in a crowd and how it made you feel when people kind of crushed up against you or brushed up against you in a weird sort of way. You probably felt really weird and violated. Yet, we allow strangers to enter into and play around in our minds all the time. We need to be as defensive and protective about who and what goes in our minds, and be as diligent to protect our minds as we are about our bodies. Fifth, we need to limit the amount of information we take in relative to our ability to process and understand that information. Okay, let me say that again. We need to limit the amount of information we take in relative to our ability to process and understand that information. Stop passively allowing things to come into your mind and start actively sorting through the things that are already there. Stop consuming and start digesting. Give up your fear of missing out on the next piece of information and replace that with a desire to know something truly. Look deeper into a topic. Go down a rabbit hole. Think laterally about things. How this thing over here affects this thing over here and affects that thing over there. Think biblically about things. In other words, love the Lord your God with all of your mind. I would argue it is better to know a little bit very well, to know a little bit truthfully, than it is to know a lot not very well. To know a lot in such a way that it has only a loose connection to the truth. One final question. Question number 3. Since one of the highest aims for Christians is to know the truth, how should we in the 21st century's exceeding skepticism understand the abundance of miracles ascribed to saints in church history? Now, let me begin with what I think the question is asking. Is it possible to prove that the miracles ascribed to the saints in church history actually happened? Now, if that's the question, I'm sorry, but it's too broad to answer. What we would have to do is take each one of the miracles that may or may not have happened in history, and we'd have to evaluate them on their own merits in order to determine their individual veracity. And that would take probably more than a lifetime of study. So what I'm going to do is move the question into a bit of a different direction. into the same type of place as the other two questions we've answered. Ask a broad question. How can I find the truth in history? Now, I have to admit I am indebted to several church historians for the perspective that you will hear. I benefited greatly in my time at Westminster Theological Seminary from some fantastic church historians coming in and out teaching me church history. But most influential in this regard is Carl Trueman, who was the main church historian at Westminster when I was there. He taught me church history, and I have read many of his works since I left there. He wrote an excellent little book that I would highly recommend called Histories, and Fallacies, Problems Faced in the Writing of History. And much of what I'm going to share here can be found in this book. I'd also recommend, actually, this is a really, really good one. It's about 80 pages called History, A Student's Guide by Nathan Finn. As I said, it's a tight 80 pages, makes a great introduction to these issues. So if you're interested in this kind of stuff, start here, then go to Trueman, and you will understand exactly how to approach church history. Now, before we move into asking whether or not we can discover the truth in history, we need to ask ourselves a more fundamental question. What is history? History is not simply a recollection of brute facts by neutral observers. Far from it. History is a narrative construction about the past. A narrative construction about the past. Yes, there are facts involved, but those facts are always selected, interpreted, and then told in a certain way by a person recalling the events. And so history is a narrative that is shaped by the person writing the history. It's narrative shaped by interpretation. Which means the task of the historian is to sort through the information, often fragmentary information, delivered to us in the past according to the biases of the recorder of that history, so that we can then discover what actually happened. So the first thing we have to say, which is a somewhat controversial statement in today's academic environment, is that we can indeed have true, meaningful knowledge of history, true, meaningful knowledge of what happened in the past. While we don't have unfettered and absolute access to the past, we can examine it. And in doing so, we can piece together what actually happened. We can discover the truth. So we need to be, as in all things, critical realists about the past. We can't know the past exhaustively or perfectly, so we always have to be critical about what we know and how we know it, but we can know it truly. That's the realist part of being a critical realist. In order to do so, we need to be aware of the same kinds of fallacies and biases that inhibit our ability to grasp the truth in any field, anywhere. For example, we have to be aware of the genetic fallacy, rejecting an idea because of its origin. Anachronism, reading modern concepts into the past. Reductionism, oversimplifying complex causes or events. Suspicion without evidence, assuming hidden motives without proof. And the ever famous post hoc propter hoc, assuming that temporal sequence implies causation. Now, these are just a number of biases and fallacies that affect history specifically, the study of history specifically. There are many more that we need to be aware of. Further, we need to be aware, as with all other ways of knowing, the role of the historian's worldview, the role of the person looking back on the material. This includes his doctrinal commitments as well. The historian will always bring presuppositions into his work. But this does not invalidate the work that a historian does. It simply means that he must be self-aware, intellectually honest, and be willing to engage in other presentations of history and other interpretations of the events of history. All right, that brings us to the end of our Q&A this time. I've got one more planned before we take a break for the month of August. And in that one, we'll deal with two questions that are somewhat controversial. Should Christians attend gay weddings? And secondly, is suicide a sin? And will a person who commits suicide go to heaven? That's all for now. Until next time.